Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be attempting to review Three Dreams in the Key of G by Marc Nash. This is literary fiction with 3 points of view. We have a creatrix, which is the most sort of outside perspective in terms of like thinking outside the box. The genome itself, which has a 4-letter alphabet in its construction of language, is verbalizing its thoughts about humanity, and we quickly realize it is because there is a person attempting to map it. In essence, the Human Genome Project, and it is sort of commentary directly on the human race and starts plotting the major through line for the novel, which I think is hubris primarily. There's a bunch of other themes, but I think hubris is the thing that combines everything together. The second point of view is a person who runs a women's shelter. She's an old woman from what we can guess, and she herself has been a victim of domestic violence, and so now is running the shelter in an effort to combat the efforts of the male thinking of violence, basically perpetuated against women over and over again ad nauseum. The last perspective is an Irish woman just around the Troubles. Her partner is a, whatchamacallit, like a militiaman, and she is chronicling her story in a non-linear way by way of a diary, which is very interesting because the arrangement of them throughout the story provides like a lot of interesting pacing and plot development in it. It's probably the most grounding of the point of views, although it may not be the most propelling in the fiction. In the diary, it reminded me a lot of a recent book that I read called Night Bitch, in which it's a woman who recently became a mother who's being like subsumed by the act of caregiving. She feels her identity slipping away, and in that book, she begins becoming more feral and combative with her partner and starts metamorphosizing into like a dog. But in this one, her fighting back is in some ways more interesting because we see how like erudite she is with language, and sort of in a deep sort of sadness in the fact that she wasn't able to pursue her own dream. It was consumed by the family's dream and by the husband's dream of having kids and fulfilling her role in society, performing her gender adequately, and so not going to school. And yet she has this like amazing voice, amazing command of language and playfulness within that. She can convey a lot of meaning with each sentence, sometimes solely through the use of the words that she chooses having double or sometimes multiple meanings, and the structure of her journal often echoing a similar sort of playfulness or a secondary meaning getting across. And yet all of the characters, including the genome, is not held to like a specific paragon. Like they are monolithic of that subtype or archetype that they've been prescribed by society and by this structure in the book. They are quite flawed in some ways, as it becomes clear that as society has engineered itself, the social constructs in which we basically imbibe every day and therefore make up our reality as we perceive it, there's no real hope in society of not becoming flawed or contradiction. For instance, there's a nature versus nurture interplay that's happening that is framed in a really fruitful way, because at the time, during those troubles and beforehand as well, nature versus nurture was a very like biological essentialist look at life, and I believe it was even coined by a Nazi scientist Don't quote me on that, but I'm fairly sure. And so if you drill down into it, it is by its very nature exclusionary, which is one of the reasons why Nazis were so obsessed with trans people and completely eradicating all scientific knowledge about trans people, which is why it's very hard to find information, and trans people seem so new in society. They're like the free radicals that is permeating the structure of the book, which I find fascinating as well. Bringing it back to hubris, in the sense that there's a hubris in the mapping of the human genome, the futility of it. Yes, we could probably be fruitful with that scientific advance if it were even, say, possible, which we weren't sure about at the time of, at least ostensibly, when this is taking place. It is non-linear, but it does seem situated somewhat in the past, at least for the Irish person, for sure anyway. So I latched onto that sort of time period, even though that may not be the case. But the through line anyway still plays regardless of the time. The outcomes of scientific advance in mapping the genome would invariably be unfruitful or even malicious or weaponized, because the framing for science invariably has bad actors in it, just like in every other space. And our social constructs and the interplay therein make it so that there would be people who use that to only further in-groups and out-groups, being racist, being transphobic, being homophobic, being exclusionary to anyone except the prescribed rule, basically. We then get another line of hubris when we switch back to the crone and we find out that she is running that clinic ostensibly, but it turns out it's something a little bit more nefarious or terrorizing. Yet I found it very difficult to condemn her, even though she herself has some ingrained sexism, yet she is also very emblematic of the trauma cycle in itself. She can't help but seem to want to perpetuate the same kind of violence that was done onto her, which is a very have not processed trauma, but acting on the trauma in maybe not a cognizant way, but a motivated thinking kind of way. Loss of agency transcribes directly to taking away agency from other people and equalizing the power dynamics that is perceived there. But her way of dealing with men and wanting to remove them from the equation is ultimately harming the overall concept of what we would now call feminism. But back then, it does actually seem kind of congruent with second wave feminism in a way, like exclusionary feminism, basically. She is still sexist towards people that don't meet her specific view of what a woman should be and how they should act. So she's no more better or different than society prescribing those rules for women as well, right? So again, it's like the interplay of social constructs, which has subsumed the idea of nurture versus nature. It's much more fruitful to think of it in sociological terms, because we construct our social reality and we can therefore deconstruct it and put it back together again, though we don't, because the people in power / the people that have agency in our society as it has been erected refuse to do that. And the way that they refuse to do that, or at least one of the ways in which they combat it easily, is anti-intellectualism, which contextualizes language quite often. And so that's why this feels very feminist and subversive in its use of language. It refuses to be tramped down, commercialized. Even, I wouldn't say it is hard to understand, but it is so nuanced and complex as to try to reflect the intricacies of the women it is trying to portray and empower in a way. So, for instance, to quote Frontera, who is to say that removing a person's language or a culture's language is less violent than war or genocide, right? Our notions of violence are even constructed by a very masculine outlook. If you look at the Odyssey and how it was translated for years and years and years by men, for instance, and then the recent translation by Emily Wilson and how they differ and contrast in terms of the portrayal of masculinity, violence, aggression, all of these things, they're quite different. And so every aspect of the way that we negotiate our space and make sense of our space and the way that we therefore interact with it is on a patriarchal level, and so contaminated. So it feels very difficult to completely condemn the crone in her wanting and need to rid the world of like all men, basically. And it goes back to, you know, what if the free radical or the mistake or whatever is mankind now? What if we move past that, such that we know what post-capitalism is, we know what society is doing and what it benefits. The 99% of us do not benefit from it. And so it is easy to be seduced by her outlook, basically, and that's what makes her a very compelling character. And then the final line of hubris, I think, with through line for our mother in Ireland, who is quietly subversive in trying to maintain and transpose her voice. She is quietly subversive in a way that is actually more empowering and beneficial to society, yet it looks like the most diminutive position out of everybody, because the crone is sort of exercising a form of masculinity in which she wants to destroy masculinity itself. Our maiden is instead trying to preserve her voice and not be diminished. And again, the use of language in those sections are just like very compelling because they tell very nuanced stories about her. The language is very reflective, and in the genome sections as well. Every sentence by sentence and the diction that is used reflects the character very well. In the genome section, it's all like high science terms and like technical and logical terms and stuff, whereas our Irish mother is only trying to preserve and maintain her personality and to remember who she was, why she made those decisions, what she thinks about her kids, what those kids do to her, and gender roles specifically, but also the subtle ways in which misogyny and patriarchy are ingrained in society for her as well. She too also gets somewhat like catty or whatever when judging other mothers, and that is a defense mechanism as well. Everything is being sorted on a patriarchal scale, and when we see that someone else would find us lacking, we react in a sort of masculine or gender role type situation way in which we try to guard ourselves. It's a defense mechanism, and so she's engaging in that as well. And I think she recognizes that on some level. I don't have the life experience to relate to the specific passages with her kids, so I found that very interesting. I'm looking forward to watching other people's reviews of that, because not having kids, I still related to it, but in a different way. I've always subscribed to the idea that having kids would be terrifying, because I'm always just trying to maintain my own selfhood, like my actual well-being, my maintenance of my personhood takes up so much mental energy that for me to think about having a child and then also worrying about that, I think I'm not built for that. And so, you know, that's why I'm old, or not old, but That's why I'm this age and haven't had kids yet. Whatever milestone people need to hit to feel ready for that, I haven't hit it. For me, when people ask me why I haven't had kids, I ask them if they've seen Apollo 13. That's my metaphor for it, basically. You're in a small tin can in an unknown environment. Many things could go wrong, including the actual tin can that you're using. If you land on the moon and you have a transformative experience somehow, it's unlikely because the actual vessel you're in is so constructed by humans that it would probably mess up anyway. But if you do manage to have that transformative experience, then you have to survive re-entry, which I imagine would be like the kid growing up and going to college or whatever, and you have to see who the hell you are after that transformative experience. Sounds terrifying to me. To bring it back from that happy thought and talk about the genome aspect of it, it's very fun to have that as a propelling mechanism in the text because for one, it makes me think of Jurassic Park when that DNA strand or whatever is talking to the people, yet it's so anthropomorphized that it's like basically a human explaining to humans about what scientists did using itself to create a new thing, which was dinosaurs in this case. There's the same sort of like playfulness here in that ATCG, I think it is, right? Elements, which is a fun way of like almost anthropomorphizing them, right? It's very interesting as a thought process because you think that if DNA or genomes or cells or anything really could talk, which in a way that they do, we know that they interact and we know that they like evolve and change exactly, and those are the micro parts of us. And so why wouldn't they have personality aspects, and why wouldn't you relate to them in that way? And then when they talk about the evolutionary process and like how it is bad and good, you get situations and outcomes that are not desired and you get ones that are, and that becomes evolution. On the bad side, we have like hereditary diseases or problems and outcomes on that end. But ultimately you have to fail to do something anyway, which is something that we've taken to heart in most social constructs on Earth, at least Western society has, yet we have not endeavored to replicate any of the other intelligent aspects of nature, which I think is kind of a joke as well. But so then we start seeing how complex and evolutionary these actual personalities become, because they start sort of intermingling and speaking to one another and coupling, and it results in a very fun, interesting aspect and conveys a lot of philosophical stuff in a sort of fun, sneaky way, like it's having fun learning, basically, instead of after-school special prescription. And so half of me wonders, but I don't want to know the actual answer, is I wonder if these end papers here, and at the end there's another one, and here at the end, part of me wonders if it replicates the exact times in which those things are talking, like whether they're coupled or not. If it's just the exact replication of when they appear on the page in order, like a program running, then that also is quite interesting, because a very useful way of looking at the world, I find at least, and why I like cyberpunk, this will tell you why, thinking about the brain as hardware and our social constructs as software can sometimes have very fruitful outcomes, I think. And so the idea that nature itself is running its program is very interesting on a conceptual level and interplays a lot with the text itself, I think, because there's a lot of cyclical stuff being talked about here. For instance, there's talk about replicating text And if it's not done properly for the word of God, for instance, in the monks far back, then they had to do it all over again. And presumably it was illuminating as well. So it would have taken, the lifetime work of this person, and one mistake could have, completely thrown it off and done another. Their whole life could be wasted essentially by one mistake. And instead of it becoming a fruitful one or something else, it is discarded completely, whereas nature doesn't do that. It uses it to one degree or another to improve, sometimes to the detriment of others, but most of the time to benefit and to allow a species to survive and thrive. So there's the notion that humanity doesn't remember as well. We have very short-term memory. And so when we have kids, we're continually cyclically making the same mistakes because we think that there'll be, some element of a carbon copy of ourselves to preserve whatever sorts of identity that we usually care about. In capitalism, it's our money and our estate and our names, etc. But it could just as easily be something far more neurotic, and often is. But it's still, we know the outcomes of this. We've been having kids forever, right? And we still are completely unable to further the efforts of constructing a society in which we educate our children on the mistakes of our forefathers, because we are continually inundating them with the social constructs that benefit the 1% instead of the 99%. Right? Every generation has a coming of age in which they perceive the world differently than what they are told in school, and it's always the exact same reckoning, and it's why social justice changes are so slow, if ever, to actually happen. And so there's the hubris of wanting to imprint ourselves onto our children. There's the hubris of wanting to unilaterally redefine what sex should survive, essentially, and what that outcome of the society would be, which makes me think of the Summer Prince, actually, the cyberpunk novel that's excellent. It's about a third world war is triggered, and in this new society in Brazil, I think, in a pyramid, the people with power are only women, except that every season a male is elected to have some power, but in the end they are killed in a symbolic gesture of ceding back the power into the matriarchy instead. And so that explores what an all-female led society essentially would look like as well, and I'm pretty sure Le Guin has done this as well. It's just interesting to see some science fiction concepts grounded in literary fiction. In the running of the programs and the parallels that we see of that in this text, I see a lot of Pale Fire / Blade Runner. Is this to be an empathy test within cells interlinked, within cells interlinked, within cells interlinked? So I think overall, there's a lot of heavy and interesting concepts that are delivered in a way that aren't too heavy, but still very digestible, very playful, very inviting in which to be subjective, which I found very accessible and approachable, even though the language itself seems to be exclusionary sometimes because of the diction chosen. It's goes well, again, with the form and function, the cyclical nature of everything coming back into the novel. It's just like a form meets function peak for me, basically. Obviously, Marc Nash is very obsessed with what a novel can do, and what he wanted to specifically convey about masculinity in both aspects, about social constructs, about hyperrealism, about a whole bunch of different subjects, and manages to pack it into 3 distinct voices from a feminine perspective. It doesn't feel male gazy at all to me, but I am who am I to say that, essentially. I think that's at least the intent, and you can see that in the fiction. But I think that it's a very commendable, interesting approach that obviously made me think a lot. That's why my channel is Springboard Thought. I like infinite jesting everywhere, thinking about these things. Obviously, I rated it 5 stars. I could talk about this book much more, but I feel like I've been rambling and should cut it off now. If you've read this book, I would love to know what you thought of it, what it made you think of, what you think of what I think it made me think of. And otherwise, your thoughts, leave them in the comments. We'll have a discussion, and otherwise, I'll see you later. Bye.